Good evening, and welcome back to Shaded Past. Have you ever wondered how a world that believed itself protected by faith, law, and empire could be quietly undone by something so small it could not even be seen? Tonight we step into a world that felt unshakable, right before that confidence dissolved forever. This is not a story of sudden collapse. It is a story of slow realization, of people living ordinary lives while something invisible moved closer with every single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's story together. A world that trusted itself. In the early 6th century, the Mediterranean world was bound together by roads, ports, ships, and laws built up over generations. Grain from Egypt fed cities an ocean away. Silk and spice passed through a dozen hands before reaching an imperial market. Letters and orders moved along the same routes as merchants and soldiers. To the people living inside this web, the world felt connected, dependable, and, above all, permanent. At its center stood the Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople. The city had a rhythm you could set a clock to. Bells marked the hours of prayer. Markets opened at dawn. Ships crowded into the harbor before the sun had fully risen. Water ran through the aqueducts. Food moved through state-run channels like blood through a body. Courts convened. Disease existed, of course, but it was the familiar kind. Seasonal fevers, local outbreaks, illness that came and then politely left again. Nothing about daily life suggested that the fabric holding it all together could tear. Leadership reinforced this sense of permanence. The Emperor Justinian ruled with the quiet, relentless confidence of a man who believed the Roman world could be stitched back together in his own lifetime. His armies were active, his laws were ambitious, his buildings reached toward heaven. Many of his subjects believed they were living not through decline, but through a renaissance. The past was a promise, not a warning. Consider what it must have felt like to be an ordinary citizen watching this unfold. Not from a history book, but from inside a single lifetime. You might have grown up hearing stories of Rome's western half collapsing into fragments, absorbed as a kind of distant, half-mythical cautionary tale. And now, in your own adult years, you were watching your emperor's armies retake cities that had been lost to your grandparents' generation, watching new churches rise where old ones had crumbled, watching envoys arrive from kingdoms that had once seemed impossibly far away. It must have felt, genuinely, like watching history bend back in your favor after decades of quietly bending the other way. Faith steadied the picture further. Churches were full. Rituals were familiar. When life turned hard, people prayed, fasted, gave alms, and trusted that order would return, because it always had. And yet, quietly, beneath all of this, conditions were aligning in a way no one could read yet. Cities were dense, storehouses were full, harbors never slept. And wherever grain was stored in abundance, rats thrived beside it, feasting on the same prosperity that fed the empire. Fleas rode those rats from port to port, unnoticed, unremarkable, just another ordinary detail of urban life that nobody thought twice about. There's a particular kind of dramatic irony that only becomes visible with 15 centuries of hindsight. Everything the empire was most proud of, its full granaries, its crowded ports, its efficient road network, its packed and thriving cities, was, without anyone possibly knowing it yet, quietly assembling the perfect conditions for catastrophe. Prosperity and vulnerability, it turns out, were never opposites in this story. They were the very same thing, viewed from two different angles, waiting for one small, invisible trigger to reveal which side of that coin the empire had actually been living on all along. Climate played its own quiet role in setting the stage, though no one at the time could have connected the dots. In the years just before the plague struck, contemporary writers across Europe and Asia described a strange dimming of the sun, a period when the sky itself seemed to lose some of its brightness for months on end, and harvests in many regions fell short of expectations. We now believe this was likely caused by a sequence of enormous volcanic eruptions somewhere on the globe, throwing enough ash and sulfur into the atmosphere to cool temperatures across the northern hemisphere for years. weakened harvests, stressed populations, migrating rodents searching for food and shelter in new places. None of this caused the plague directly, but it may well have primed the world for exactly the kind of catastrophe that was already, quietly, on its way. Far beyond the border of anyone's daily concern, something new was stirring. It did not announce itself with drama. A handful of deaths here, a cluster there, easy to explain away, easy to ignore. News from distant provinces arrived slowly, softened by distance and rumour, and the empire had survived worse before, or so everyone assumed. Life went on, children were born, contracts were signed, taxes were collected, soldiers drilled. And this is exactly what makes what comes next so unsettling. The Justinian Plague did not arrive into chaos. It arrived into a civilization that believed, with total sincerity, in its own permanence. Think about that for a moment. We tend to imagine the fall of great civilizations as loud events, sacked cities, burning libraries, armies at the gates. But sometimes the beginning of an ending looks like nothing at all. It looks like a ship docking on schedule. It looks like a full granary. It looks like a market morning exactly like every market morning that came before it. The most dangerous moments in history are rarely the ones that announce themselves. Somewhere on a ship crossing calm water, a flea was about to disembark into the busiest city on earth, and no one, not the sailors, not the dock workers, not the emperor in his palace with its marble floors and golden mosaics, had the faintest idea that the ground beneath their entire world was about to shift. The emperor who believed he could rebuild history. By the time that unseen illness had begun its slow crawl through the provinces, the empire was ruled by a man who did not see himself as merely holding the throne. He believed he was repairing history itself. Justinian took power in 527, inheriting an empire that was wealthy, bureaucratic, and dangerously overextended. Rome's western half had already fallen, but in the east, the machinery of Roman rule still turned. Courts still judged, taxes still flowed, and Justinian took this survival as proof that Rome's true heart still beat, and that he could make it beat everywhere again. His reign rested on three pillars: law, faith, and territory, pursued not through charisma, but through relentless, grinding administration. It was a strength. It would also become a fatal rigidity. His legal reforms were staggering in scope. Centuries of contradictory Roman law were reorganized into what became known as the corpus juris, proof to every judge and administrator who touched it that even the most tangled problems could be solved through order and structure. His religious campaigns pursued the same goal from another direction: unity through orthodoxy. Churches rose, heresies were condemned, doctrine was clarified until it left no room for dissent. Faith, in Justinian's vision, was the glue holding subject to emperor and emperor to God. And then there was the reconquest, his most audacious gamble of all. Armies were sent into North Africa, Italy, even parts of Spain, chasing the dream that lands once Roman could be Roman again. Grain ships and supply convoys moved constantly to keep those armies fed, a logistical marvel that made the empire feel not fragile, but unstoppable. Contemporaries described Justinian as tireless, reviewing documents late into the night, weighing precedent, never impulsive. His steadiness reassured everyone around him. Whatever went wrong, the emperor would fix it through the proper channel, the correct office, the right decree. He wasn't born to any of this, either, which makes his obsession with order all the more understandable. Justinian came from humble provincial roots, rising to power largely through the patronage of an uncle who had himself climbed from peasant soldier to emperor. Perhaps that improbable ascent is exactly why Justinian clung so tightly to structure once he finally held the throne. A man who had watched fortune turn on the smallest of decisions had every reason to believe that careful, meticulous control was the only real defense against chaos. And for most of his reign, that belief seemed entirely justified. Law worked. Armies won. Buildings rose. The system he trusted so completely kept delivering exactly the results he expected from it. But here is the quiet irony that history was already writing. A system this brilliant at managing known problems would prove almost helpless against a threat that fit none of its categories. An outbreak does not answer to an office. It does not respond to a decree. And Justinian's court, Hierarchical, procedural, magnificent, had no drawer to file it in. Even public health fell under this same illusion of control. Aqueducts were maintained. Waste was managed. Streets were cleaned. A well-run city was assumed to be a healthy one. Disease was something episodic, a visitor, not a verdict. All of this mattered enormously once the plague began to spread, because the empire's first instinct was to force this new horror into old, familiar boxes. Was it a local problem? A seasonal outbreak? Something for a provincial governor to quietly manage? The idea that disease alone could threaten an empire at the height of its ambition simply did not fit inside anyone's imagination yet, and there was no time to imagine it. Armies were already marching. Taxes were already committed to feeding them. The empire had momentum, and momentum, once built, is agonizingly slow to stop. There's something almost tragic in hindsight about how good Justinian was at the wrong kind of problem. He could reorganize a legal code spanning centuries. He could reconquer a province lost to barbarian kings. He could raise a dome that still stands, astonishing visitors 15 centuries later. What he could not do, what no one on earth could have done in the year 541, was see a disease coming before it arrived, or stop it once it had. The empire's genius was order. The plague did not care about order at all. Constantinople, at the very peak of its confidence. In the years just before the plague reached the capital, Constantinople did not feel like a city on the edge of catastrophe. It felt like the center of the universe. Hundreds of thousands of people lived pressed together inside its walls. Houses stacked several stories high, streets so narrow that 2 carts could barely pass, opening suddenly into markets, courtyards, and church squares. People shared walls, wells, stairways, storage rooms. Closeness was simply how the city worked. It was invisible because it was normal. Every morning began with sound. Vendors setting up stalls, cartwheels grinding over stone, bells calling the faithful to prayer. Grain ships from Egypt arrived like clockwork, and bread was not a luxury in Constantinople. It was a rite. When the loaves appeared each morning, it was a small, daily confirmation that the world was still turning correctly. Markets overflowed with fish, oil, wine, spice, cloth. Churches, from towering basilicas to tiny neighborhood shrines, structured the calendar itself. Physicians treated the sick using the medical wisdom of centuries, balancing humors, adjusting diets, applying poultices. Disease, when it came, was expected, studied, managed, not mysterious, not existential. Public infrastructure reinforced the illusion of total control. Aqueducts, cisterns, bathhouses, patrolling guards, officials who tracked prices, recorded births, enforced regulations. Someone, somewhere, was always responsible. That thought alone was deeply reassuring, and the city was a crossroads. Pilgrims, soldiers, diplomats, refugees, and merchants from every corner of the known world passed through its gates daily. This was not remarkable. It was simply Tuesday. The city had absorbed alarming rumors before and outlived every single one of them. So when the first signs appeared, a sailor falling ill after unloading cargo, a strange cluster of deaths near the harbour, nobody panicked. Ports were always a little unhealthy. This was nothing new, except it was. Information crept upward slowly, from doc to physician, from physician to priest, from priest to official. Opinions differed. Some blamed the air. Others whispered about divine punishment. Nobody yet understood the scale of what was arriving. And here is the cruelest detail of all. The city could not simply close itself off. Stopping trade meant stopping the grain. Stopping the grain meant starving the very population everyone was trying to protect. So the ships kept sailing. The markets stayed open. The city kept doing exactly what had always kept it alive, unaware that this time the same openness that fed it would also infect it. And there was one more thing the city couldn't see coming: the hippodrome. That great oval arena where tens of thousands gathered to scream for their favourite chariot teams was, without anyone realising it, one of the most dangerous places in the entire empire. Bodies packed shoulder to shoulder for hours, shared air, shared shouting, spitting, cheering. A single infected traveller in those stands could, in theory, brush past hundreds of strangers in a single afternoon. The very thing that made Constantinople feel alive, its crowds, its density, its constant human contact, was quietly building the conditions for the fastest possible spread of whatever was coming. Consider, too, just how cosmopolitan this city really was. Centuries before the word globalization would have meant anything to anyone. A single afternoon in the Constantinople marketplace might bring you within arm's reach of a Gothic mercenary, an Egyptian grain merchant, a Persian silk trader, a Slavic slave newly arrived from the northern frontier, and an Armenian priest passing through on his way to a monastery in the hills. This wasn't tolerance in any modern sense. The empire had plenty of prejudice, hierarchy, and suspicion of outsiders built into its bones. But it was, undeniably, contact. Constant, daily, unavoidable contact between people who had travelled from every direction imaginable, each of them potentially carrying something invisible along with their luggage. Constantinople stood at the absolute peak of its confidence, and it was from that very peak that its long, terrible descent was about to begin. Silent passengers on familiar roads. Long before it reached the capital, the plague was already moving, not through any hidden channel, but along the most ordinary, most trusted paths in the empire, roads worn smooth by centuries of feet. Shipping lanes sailed year after year without a second thought. Trade was not occasional. It was survival itself, and it never stopped moving. Grain was the beating heart of that movement. Egypt's Nile floodplain fed the empire, and its harvests sailed north on schedule, like clockwork, every single year. These ships were slow, heavy, and full of far more than grain. Sailors living aboard for weeks, dock workers hauling sacks at every stop, and in the dark of the hold, rats nesting comfortably among the spilled kernels. Fleas rode those rats. Nobody noticed. Nobody had any reason to. Picture the hold of one of these grain ships for a moment. Dark, warm, dry, packed floor to ceiling with exactly the kind of dense, undisturbed shelter a rodent population could thrive in for weeks at a time. A single ship might carry dozens of rats, breeding quietly in the dark while the crew focused entirely on the far more visible concerns of wind, tide, and cargo weight. Nobody counted rats before a voyage. Nobody inspected a hold for fleas. The entire concept of an animal vector for disease simply didn't exist yet, which meant one of history's most efficient delivery systems for a killer pathogen was allowed to operate in complete, total secrecy, voyage after voyage, for years. Beyond grain, silk and spice drifted in from the east, timber and metal from the north, ivory and cloth from Africa. Each shipment changing hands dozens of times, each transfer a fresh opportunity for something unseen to move along with it. What made these routes so devastatingly effective wasn't speed, it was regularity. The same ships, the same ports, the same schedule, year after year. A disease that could patiently wait inside a host didn't need to be fast. It only needed the world to keep doing exactly what it had always done. And the world obliged. When the earliest reports of strange illness trickled in from Egypt and its neighbours, trade didn't pause. If anything, it sped up, because disrupted harvests in one region meant supplies were needed elsewhere even faster. Ports themselves were perfect incubators. Crowded, chaotic, full of strangers who mixed for a day and scattered in a dozen directions. Sick sailors were quietly swapped out at the next stop, their illness blamed on the hardships of a long voyage rather than anything contagious. There was no such thing as quarantine yet, not as policy, not even as an idea. Goods moved through checkpoints fast, and officials cared about documentation, not disease. And in a deeply religious world, closing a port might even have felt like defying God's will. So the plague didn't travel a single road into the empire's heart. It spread outward from a dozen points at once, following overlapping threads of a vast trading web. A web too tangled for anyone to cut in time, even if they'd understood what they were looking at. This is, in many ways, the central irony of the entire story. Everything that made the 6th century Mediterranean feel modern, connected, and prosperous by the standards of its time. The reliable shipping schedules, the deep trust between distant trading partners, the sheer efficiency of an empire that could move a harvest from an Egyptian field to a Constantinople bakery in a matter of weeks, was precisely the machinery that would carry catastrophe to every corner it touched. There was no villain in this story, no single reckless decision that set it all in motion. There was only a functioning, well-oiled system doing exactly what it had always done at exactly the wrong possible moment. Modern scientists now believe they know exactly what was riding along on those ships. A bacterium called Yersinia pestis, the same organism that would return 8 centuries later as the Black Death. DNA extracted from 6th century burial pits, sequenced only in the last couple of decades, confirmed what historians had long suspected but could never prove. This wasn't some vague, unknowable ancient sickness. It was plague in the most literal and clinical sense. The same enemy humanity would face again and again across the centuries, wearing a different mask each time. But nobody in the 6th century had that knowledge, or anything close to it. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know fleas were the vector, or that rats were the reservoir, or that a bite could deliver an infection that would kill within a week. All they knew was that people who touched the sick often became sick themselves. And even that observation, as sound as it was, offered no real way to stop a disease that was already moving through the grain, the ships, the rats, and the fleas long before the first human symptom ever appeared. It arrived, in the end, not as an invader, but as a disguise, hidden inside the very cargo everyone trusted completely. The first warnings misread. The earliest signs surfaced far from Constantinople, in places already hardened to hardship. And that, more than anything, is why nobody recognized them for what they were. Egypt felt it first. Densely populated along the Nile, wired directly into every trade artery in the empire, it began reporting something unusual. People who had been perfectly healthy collapsing within days. Sudden fever. Painful swelling in the groin, armpits, neck. Delirium. Death. Often before a physician could even attempt treatment. At first, this looked like just another bad season. Egypt knew disease cycles well. The Nile's floods shifted every year, and malaria and dysentery were old, familiar hazards. Officials recorded the deaths as they always had. Priests led prayers. Fields still needed tending, so people tended them. Try to imagine being a physician in one of these Egyptian river towns, examining a patient you'd treated successfully 100 times before for ordinary fevers, only to watch this one deteriorate in a way nothing in your training had prepared you for. You'd reach for the same remedies that had always worked. You'd apply the same careful diagnostic logic passed down from your teachers and their teachers before them. And you'd watch with a creeping, wordless dread as none of it made any difference at all. That confusion. The sense of a trusted, functioning system suddenly failing to explain what was right in front of you, is perhaps the truest emotional core of this entire story, repeated over and over in city after city for years to come. What made this outbreak different wasn't obvious yet, because it didn't behave like anything familiar. It struck one village hard and spared its neighbour completely. It vanished for weeks, then reappeared somewhere else entirely. It refused to follow any pattern anyone could name. From Egypt, it crept along the coast to Alexandria's overflowing harbour, then onward into Syria, Palestine, and Anatolia, carried inland by the same roads and caravans that had always connected these regions. Letters describing the outbreak took weeks to arrive in Constantinople, and by the time they did, conditions on the ground had often already changed completely. Urgency simply couldn't travel that fast. Consider the strange, cruel geography of this delay. A letter describing an outbreak in a small Egyptian river town might take a month or more to reach an official desk in Constantinople, carried by hand, by ship, through multiple relay points, each one adding its own small delay. By the time that letter was finally read aloud, filed, and perhaps discussed at some unhurried administrative meeting, the outbreak it described might already have run its course, vanished, and reappeared somewhere else entirely, 300 miles away. The Empire's information simply could not move at the speed its enemy did. Rome had built the finest road network, the finest naval infrastructure, the finest postal relay system the ancient world had ever seen. And none of it was remotely fast enough to outrun a disease that didn't need permission, paperwork, or a change of horses to keep moving forward. And crucially, the illness didn't spare the poor and pity the powerful. It moved through sailors, merchants, clergy, and officials with the exact same indifference. That alone unsettled people more than the death toll itself. A plague that followed social lines could be explained away. One that ignored them entirely could not. Some communities tried isolating the sick. Travellers were eyed with new suspicion. But necessity always pulled people back into contact. Markets needed customers, families needed income, and the world simply couldn't stop turning just because something frightening was moving through it. By the time the disease reached the outskirts of the capital, it had already been travelling, quietly, for years, testing responses, exposing the limits of medicine and prayer alike, moving patiently along the empire's own lifelines. For the eastern provinces, this was no longer breaking news. It was already daily life, and their suffering, largely forgotten by later histories, was what carried the disease, silently, straight toward the empire's heart. We know some of this firsthand, remarkably, thanks to a court historian named Procopius, a man who stood close enough to power to watch it all unfold and wrote down what he saw with startling, uncomfortable honesty. He described the swellings, the fevers, the strange randomness of who lived and who died, with the detail of someone who understood he was witnessing something the world had never fully recorded before. His account, still read today, is one of the closest things we have to a first-hand voice reaching across 15 centuries to tell us. This actually happened, and it was every bit as terrifying as you're imagining. What Procopius couldn't have known was how useful his careful, almost clinical descriptions would become to future scientists. His account of symptoms lines up disturbingly well with what we now understand about bubonic plague, giving modern researchers confidence that they were looking at the very same disease that would haunt Europe again in later centuries. It reaches the capital. When the plague finally arrived in Constantinople, there was no dramatic announcement, no single moment that separated before from after. It slipped in the same way it had entered every other city before it, disguised as something ordinary. Ships from Egypt, Syria, and beyond docked exactly as they always had. Cargo was unloaded. Paperwork was stamped. Nobody stood at the harbour watching for danger, because nobody knew there was any to watch for. The first cases blurred into the background noise of a busy port city. A sailor fell ill after a shift unloading grain. A porter collapsed in a warehouse. A dockside household lost more members than usual in a single week. Physicians responded the way they always had, treating fever with cooling measures, swelling with poultices. And the results were exactly as inconsistent as they'd always been. Troubling, but not unprecedented. Then the pattern began to sharpen. Illness clustered near the harbours and crowded roads, in the same multi-storey tenements packed with families sharing a single well. And still, some streets were devastated while the one beside it seemed untouched. Nobody could explain why. Was it the air? The water? Something moral? Something divine? Every theory fit some of the evidence and failed the rest. We now know, of course, that the real explanation had nothing to do with air, water, or morality at all. It had to do with something far smaller and far stranger. The precise, largely random movement of infected fleas and the rodents carrying them, block by block, household by household, following patterns of food storage and building density that no 6th century observer had any conceptual framework to even look for. A family with a well-sealed grain store might go untouched for months. A neighbouring household with a small crack in a storeroom wall, inviting exactly the wrong kind of visitor, might lose 3 generations within a single week. From the outside, this looked like divine selection. From what we understand today, it was closer to a horrifyingly indifferent kind of chance. What made the truth so hard to see wasn't ignorance. It was the sheer scale of the city itself. In a small town, a spike in deaths is impossible to miss. In a city of hundreds of thousands, loss can hide in plain sight, scattered across enough neighbourhoods that daily life simply absorbs it for a while. Rumours filled the silence where explanation should have been. Corrupted grain, foreign merchants, divine wrath. None of it was true, but all of it offered something the moment desperately needed. the feeling that the world still made sense. And still, the machinery of the city didn't stop. Closing the ports meant losing the grain supply. Restricting movement meant paralyzing commerce and government alike. The risks of acting were immediate and obvious. The risks of doing nothing were still maddeningly uncertain. So the churches filled instead. Processions moved through the streets, calling for mercy. And in the cruelest irony imaginable, these gatherings, meant to offer protection, only pulled more people into close, dangerous proximity. Nobody understood that yet. Picture one of these processions for a moment. Hundreds of people, packed shoulder to shoulder, moving slowly through narrow streets behind priests, carrying sacred relics, voices rising together in prayer, candles flickering against the gathering dusk. From the inside, it must have felt like exactly the right response. A community drawing together in its darkest hour, refusing to let fear scatter it into isolated, frightened households. From what we understand today about how this disease actually spread, it's almost certainly true that these same gatherings, born entirely out of hope and desperation, quietly accelerated the very catastrophe they were praying so fervently to end. There is no villain in that irony, only the unbearable gap between what people knew and what they needed to know. By the time the scale of the disaster became undeniable, the plague was no longer a crisis that could be contained. It had already passed through too many layers of the city to be stopped by any single decision. Constantinople, the most connected city on earth, had become the plague's greatest opportunity, not because it was weak, but precisely because it was strong. At its worst, contemporary accounts describe a city burying an almost unimaginable number of people every single day. Figures historians still debate, some putting the daily death toll at several thousand during the deadliest weeks, even allowing for exaggeration, even allowing for the fact that ancient writers loved a dramatic number. The scale described is staggering enough that modern historians treat it as one of the deadliest sustained mortality events any city had ever experienced up to that point in human history. Picture it for a moment. A city of perhaps 500,000 people, watching a meaningful fraction of its population disappear within a single season. Imagine walking to the market and noticing, with a cold, sinking feeling, that half the familiar faces along your usual route were simply gone. That was the reality closing in on Constantinople, even as the ships kept arriving and the bells kept ringing exactly as they always had. What the sickness actually did to a body. It's worth pausing here to understand exactly what people were watching happen to their neighbours, their children, their spouses, because the symptoms themselves are part of why the fear ran so deep. It usually began quietly. A person would feel suddenly, inexplicably tired. Then came the fever, rising fast, often accompanied by chills and a pounding headache. Within a day or two, painful swellings. What physicians of the time and later ages would call buboes began to appear in the groin, the armpits, or the neck, sometimes growing to the size of an egg or larger, hot to the touch and excruciating to move around. For some, the story ended there, with slow, agonizing decline over a week or more. For others, the disease moved faster and crueler, spreading into the bloodstream or the lungs, bringing delirium, blackened skin from internal bleeding, and death within a day or two of the very first symptom. Contemporaries described sudden collapses in the street, people who had seemed perfectly healthy that same morning found dead by evening. And here's the detail that truly haunted 6th century Constantinople. There was no reliable rule for who survived and who didn't. Young, strong dockworkers died. Frail, elderly clergy recovered. Physicians who treated hundreds of the sick sometimes escaped entirely untouched, while others fell within days of their very first patient. Without any understanding of immunity, exposure, or bacterial load, this randomness felt less like biology and more like a verdict being handed down by forces no one could see, predict, or plead with. Two neighbours, two fates. To really feel the shape of this story, it helps to imagine it at the smallest possible scale. Not an empire, not even a city, but a single street. Picture two households living side by side near the harbour district, close enough to hear each other's voices through the shared wall between them. In the first house lives a dockworker, his wife, and their two young children. In the second lives an elderly weaver, living alone since her husband's death some years before, supported by a modest trade she still practices out of habit as much as necessity. The dockworker falls ill first. Unsurprising, given how much of his day is spent handling cargo straight off the ships. Within 3 days, the fever takes him. His wife, exhausted from nursing him, and now the children, has no time to properly grieve before she, too, begins to show the first unmistakable signs. Next door, the weaver. Older, more isolated, rarely venturing beyond her own doorway, watches the commotion through her window with the particular helplessness of someone who has already lived through enough loss to know there's little she can offer beyond a covered plate of food left quietly on the neighbouring doorstep. She never falls ill at all. Not during this wave, and not during the next one either, for reasons neither she nor anyone else in the city could have possibly explained. There was no justice in this. No hidden logic waiting to be discovered if only someone looked closely enough. The dockworker's constant exposure to ships and cargo should, by modern understanding, have made him statistically more vulnerable. And it did. But statistics are cold comfort to 2 orphan children, now taken in by an elderly neighbour who never expected, at her age, to be raising anyone at all. Multiply this single street by every street in the city, and you begin to understand why the plague felt less like a disaster and more like an entirely new, unbearable way of measuring time. Not in years or seasons anymore, but in who was still here and who wasn't. Living inside the fear. Try, for a moment, to imagine an ordinary morning inside this reality. You wake before dawn out of old habit, the same habit you've had for years, and for one brief, unguarded moment, before memory catches up with you, the day feels completely normal. Then it arrives, that now familiar weight settling back onto your chest, the mental checklist nobody ever wanted to learn. Who was sick yesterday? Whether the fever has broken or worsened overnight? Whether it's safe to send the children to fetch water? Whether the baker 3 doors down has opened his shop today? Or whether, like so many others recently, he simply hasn't been seen. This was not a single terrible day. This was every day, for months, stretching into years. The plague did not replace daily life. It seeped into it, one small adjustment at a time, until fear became just another background condition of being alive. Families woke to find a member feverish and confused, and there was often little to do but call a physician if one could be found, prepare what remedies existed, and wait. Waiting became its own exhausting occupation, waiting to see who else would fall ill, whether a neighbouring household had been spared, whether the outbreak was finally easing. No clear signal ever came. Some people withdrew as far as they could, avoiding markets, limiting visitors, staying behind closed doors. Others had no such luxury. Dockworkers, bakers, water carriers, and grave diggers couldn't retreat without abandoning the very things the city needed to survive. For them, fear simply became something to carry alongside the work. Markets stayed open but grew quieter. People moved quickly, bought only what they needed, kept a little more distance than they used to. Churches, meanwhile, filled beyond capacity. Candles lit, icons touched, prayers repeated by people desperate for comfort medicine could no longer provide. Nobody yet understood that the very act of gathering to seek protection was helping the disease spread further. Physicians worked past exhaustion, moving house to house with dwindling resources. Some died. Others simply stopped, unable to keep facing failure after failure. Home care became the default. Families nursing each other through illness with nothing but instinct and desperation, and when death came, it often came quietly, privately, with barely time for a proper goodbye before the next crisis demanded attention. Grief stopped following its usual shape. Instead of one loss followed by mourning, families absorbed loss after loss in rapid succession, with no time to process any of it before the next arrived. Funerals shrank. Rituals shortened. And yet, even abbreviated, even rushed, they never disappeared completely. A prayer was still spoken. A cloth was still used. Some fragment of dignity was preserved, even at the worst of it. Strangers became suspects. Neighbours became calculated risks. And yet, astonishingly, acts of quiet generosity persisted throughout. People sharing food, caring for the sick outside their own families, driven by nothing but personal conviction. The city's soundscape itself transformed. Funeral bells rang more often. Markets grew quiet. Nights felt emptier, darker, the usual hum of commerce fading into something closer to silence. And perhaps the deepest change was psychological. The quiet erosion of a belief nobody had ever thought to question, that tomorrow would resemble today. People stopped planning far ahead. Long projects were abandoned. The future narrowed down to whatever the next few days might bring. And still, bread was baked. Water was drawn. Children played when they safely could. The city did not collapse. It endured, altered, carrying its fear forward like a weight nobody could set down. Imagine being a parent in that city, tucking a child into bed each night with no way to promise them that tomorrow would be safe. Imagine being a young couple, newly married, wondering whether it made any sense at all to plan a future together when the future itself had become the most uncertain thing in the world. These weren't abstract historical figures. They were people exactly like us, capable of the same love, the same hope, the same quiet terror, living through something almost none of us today can truly imagine, because almost none of us have ever had to, when medicine and prayer both fell short. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from constantly being asked questions you cannot answer. Imagine being a priest in this era, standing at the bedside of a dying parishioner's child for the third time that week, being asked, quietly, desperately, why? Why this family? Why this child? Why now? And having nothing to offer but scripture, comfort, and your own uncertain faith that there was, somewhere beyond understanding, a reason. Imagine being the physician standing beside him, having already exhausted every remedy your training ever taught you, watching the same fever follow the same terrible course it always did, no matter what you tried. Both men, in their own ways, were being asked to hold back an ocean with their bare hands. Neither could. And yet, remarkably, almost none of them simply walked away. As the plague tightened its grip, people reached for the two systems that had always explained suffering before, medicine and faith. Neither one held the answer this time, but together they kept people from falling apart entirely. 6th century medicine rested on the ancient theory of bodily balance, that health meant harmony between the body's fluids and illness meant that harmony had broken. Fever suggested excess heat, so physicians applied cooling measures. Swelling suggested trapped corruption, so poultices were pressed against them. Sometimes bloodletting attempted to restore the body's balance. This wasn't guesswork. It was a careful, established system that had served for centuries. But the plague simply didn't obey it. Patients treated identically lived or died with no discernible pattern. Physicians, already stretched past exhaustion and falling ill themselves, watched their own methods fail again and again, and yet nobody abandoned medicine altogether because uncertainty had always been part of it. This was simply uncertainty at a scale nobody had faced before. Where medicine faltered, faith stepped forward. Christianity offered something medicine couldn't, meaning. Illness became a test, a mystery, a form of divine humility being forced onto the proud. Prayers rose in public and in private. Fasting intensified. Relics were carried through the streets in solemn procession. None of it altered the disease's course, but it gave people something to do, and in a moment defined by helplessness, that mattered enormously. The two systems rarely competed. Physicians were often devout. Clergy often supported medical treatment. People simply moved between both, consulting a doctor and praying in the same afternoon without ever seeing a contradiction. But faith could complicate things too. If illness came from God, some reasoned, then resisting it might be pointless, or even disrespectful. Others believed greater devotion would bring relief, which only encouraged the very crowded gatherings that spread the disease further. Folk remedies filled whatever gaps remained. Amulets worn against the skin. Herbs burned in doorways. Small household rituals repeated out of hope more than expectation. None of it cured anything. All of it offered the powerful illusion of control. The hardest question of all had no answer from either system. Why did some survive and others didn't? Piety offered no guarantee. Wealth offered no guarantee. Medicine offered no guarantee. And in that uncertainty, both systems bent without breaking. Physicians kept treating, priests kept praying, and together they held a terrified population together long enough to endure what neither could actually cure. It's tempting, from our modern vantage point, to look back at bloodletting and poultices and processions of relics and feel a kind of pity, or even superiority. If only they had known what we know now. But consider this. 14 centuries from now, someone may look back at our own era's medicine with exactly the same mixture of respect and disbelief. Every civilization does the best it can with the tools it has. What's remarkable about 6th century Constantinople isn't that its medicine failed against a disease modern science wouldn't even properly identify for another 1400 years. What's remarkable is that people kept trying anyway, kept showing up at each other's bedsides, kept mixing remedies that mostly didn't work, kept praying prayers that couldn't stop a bacterium, because doing something was the only alternative to doing nothing at all. Even the emperor was not safe. For as long as the disease had ravaged his city, Justinian himself had remained untouched, and that untouchedness had quietly become its own kind of reassurance. If the emperor still stood, surely the empire still stood too. Then the fever came for him as well. It began exactly the way it began for everyone else. Quiet, forgettable symptoms easily mistaken for exhaustion, fatigue, fever, weakness. At first, the palace said nothing. The court carried on as if everything were normal, because that illusion of normalcy was itself a form of governance. But illness does not respect discretion for long. When the telltale swellings appeared, there was no more hiding it. The empire's finest physicians were summoned. Every treatment the city had tried on its own dying was now tried, more carefully, more desperately, on the man at its centre. And it worked no better on him than it had on anyone else. News spread through the city despite every effort to contain it, and in an already anxious population, rumour outran fact within hours. Some claimed he was already dead. Others insisted he'd never truly been ill at all. The emperor's body became a screen onto which the entire city projected its deepest fears. And underneath the panic sat a much colder problem. Justinian had no clear successor ready to seize the reins at a moment's notice. His entire style of rule depended on his personal, constant involvement. Every law, every appointment, every military order passed through him directly. Remove him, even temporarily, and the whole machine simply idled, waiting for instructions nobody else was authorized to give. It was a brutal, uncomfortable lesson. The very centralization that had made his government so effective in ordinary times became its greatest weakness in crisis. Courtiers quietly reassessed alliances. Possible successors were quietly, carefully considered. No open struggle broke out, but the tension in every hallway of the palace was unmistakable. Somewhere in that palace, his wife, the Empress Theodora, was watching all of this unfold with the sharp political instincts that had already made her one of the most formidable figures in the empire's history. Years earlier, during a violent uprising that had threatened to topple Justinian's throne entirely, it was reportedly Theodora who refused to let him flee the city, urging him instead to stand and fight, a decision credited with saving his reign. Now, with her husband fighting for his life against an enemy no army could defeat, she found herself once again the steadying presence at the centre of a crisis, managing a nervous court, controlling the flow of information, and quietly ensuring that the empire's machinery kept turning even while its supposed engine lay motionless in a palace chamber. Outside the palace walls, the effect was more complicated than simple dread. For some, it deepened the fear. If even the emperor could fall, no one anywhere was safe. For others, strangely, it offered a sliver of grim solidarity. The ruler now enduring exactly what so many families already had. Weeks stretched on. His condition rose and fell unpredictably, mirroring the disease itself, a cruel echo of the uncertainty gripping the entire city. Imagine being one of the palace attendants during those weeks, required by duty to remain close to a man carrying the very disease killing thousands outside the palace walls, unable to refuse the assignment, unable to fully protect yourself, torn between loyalty, fear, and the simple, human instinct towards self-preservation. Several attendants reportedly did fall ill themselves during this period, a detail easy to skip past in the broader sweep of imperial history, but worth pausing on for a moment. Ordinary people, doing an extraordinarily dangerous job, mostly remembered today, if at all, as a single anonymous line in an ancient chronicle. And then, finally, he recovered. The relief across the empire was immense, and many read his survival as unmistakable proof of divine favour. But something had shifted permanently, even in victory. The assumption that the emperor's mere presence guaranteed stability had been shattered, and it could never be fully repaired. Justinian returned to the throne a changed man, ruling now with the quiet, permanent awareness that no title, no wealth, and no amount of careful planning could ever fully guarantee safety again. There's a particular kind of vertigo that must come with surviving something that killed so many people around you, especially when you're the one person everyone else looks to for reassurance that the world still makes sense. Justinian had spent his entire reign building the illusion. Not a dishonest one, but a genuine, deeply held belief. That order, law, and faith could hold back chaos indefinitely. His own body had just proven, in the most personal way imaginable, that this was never entirely true. He would go on ruling for decades more. He would never again rule with quite the same unshaken certainty. Life goes on, quietly transformed. Even at its worst, the plague did not erase the small, stubborn rhythms of ordinary life. It simply bent them. People still dressed in the same wool and linen tunics they always had, still wrapped themselves in the same practical cloaks. Purple, reserved strictly for imperial rank, still marked power at a glance. But now, clean clothing carried new weight. A fragile symbol of order clung to even as households were consumed by illness. People changed clothes less often, partly from exhaustion, partly from a half-understood fear of contaminated fabric. Yet dressing with dignity, even in grief, remained non-negotiable. Bakers still rose before dawn. Dockworkers still timed their days to the ships. When illness thinned the workforce, untrained neighbours quietly filled the gap, doing what they could. Meals stayed simple. Bread, olives, cheese, the occasional fish. But sharing a table now came with quiet calculation. Who was sick? Who wasn't? Who should eat separately today? Public baths, once the social centre of the city, slowly emptied, not by any decree, but by the gradual erosion of habit. Hospitality strained under the same pressure. Turning away a guest felt shameful, but welcoming one now felt dangerous. Families made careful, painful exceptions for close kin while quietly avoiding strangers altogether. Children raised entirely within this altered world absorbed its rules without ever questioning them, the way children always do. A boy born the year the plague first arrived might grow up believing it was simply normal for the streets to empty by mid-afternoon, normal for funeral bells to ring more often than wedding bells, normal for his mother to check his skin every evening for the faintest hint of swelling before allowing him to sleep. He would have no memory of the busier, louder, more carefree city his grandparents described in hushed, wistful tones. And by the time he was old enough to understand what had been lost, an entire generation had already grown up, treating caution not as a response to crisis, but simply as what it meant to be alive. Clergy remained instantly recognizable in their robes, moving constantly through the city to visit the sick and bury the dead, sometimes avoided out of fear, yet never abandoning the role that made them essential. Children's games moved indoors as parents grew cautious about the streets. Even something as small as a handshake became a decision rather than a reflex, a gesture that had meant nothing at all a year earlier, a greeting exchanged without a second thought between merchants closing a deal or friends meeting in the street, now carried a small, silent calculation behind it. How recently had this person visited the harbour? Had anyone in their household fallen ill? Was the warmth of an old friendship worth even a small, unquantifiable risk? Most people, most of the time, still chose the handshake. Human connection, it turns out, is remarkably hard to fully talk yourself out of, even in the face of genuine danger. There is something particularly haunting about the way ordinary craftsmanship carried on even at the height of catastrophe. Somewhere in the city, a shoemaker was still stitching soles for sandals because feet still needed covering no matter how many funerals passed his window that week. A weaver was still working wool into cloth because bodies still needed wrapping, whether for the living or, increasingly, for burial. The dressmaker who once tailored garments for weddings now, more often than not, found herself preparing simple shrouds instead. The same needle, the same thread, turned suddenly toward an entirely different purpose. Trades didn't stop. They simply bent toward whatever the crisis demanded most. Death rituals bent hardest of all. Washing and wrapping a body, carrying it beyond the walls, speaking prayers over the grave. These customs were centuries deep, and even when mortality forced them to shrink, they never disappeared completely. A hurried funeral still included a prayer. A simplified burial still used a cloth. That fragment of ritual, however small, was what let people hold onto their own humanity, even as the losses piled up around them. What's remarkable isn't how much changed, it's how much didn't. People leaned on the familiar. Familiar clothes, familiar prayers, familiar gestures. Precisely because habit demanded so much less energy than reinvention, at a moment when energy itself was the scarcest resource of all. There's a lesson buried in that small, stubborn persistence, one that shows up again and again throughout history whenever disaster strikes a community. It isn't the dramatic gestures that carry people through catastrophe, not usually. It's the small, repeated, almost unconscious rituals. The cup of tea made the same way every morning. The prayer recited from memory without needing to think about the words. The simple act of getting dressed properly, even when nothing else about the day makes sense. In 6th century Constantinople, those tiny anchors of normalcy weren't trivial at all. They were, in their own quiet way, acts of resistance against a world that seemed determined to make nothing feel stable ever again. When the city could no longer keep pace with death. Eventually, death stopped being an interruption to daily life in Constantinople. It became one of its defining features. There is a particular, quiet cruelty in watching a system built over centuries to honor the dead individually. A system of names remembered, prayers spoken specifically for a specific soul, graves marked and visited. Buckle under a volume of loss it was simply never designed to absorb. This wasn't a failure of compassion. It was arithmetic, overwhelming ritual, a problem no amount of grief or devotion could solve on its own. At first, families managed loss exactly as tradition demanded, washing the body, wrapping it, carrying it beyond the walls for burial, gathering briefly with neighbours to grieve. But as the death toll climbed, this structure simply couldn't hold. Households didn't lose one member. They lost several, sometimes within the same week, leaving survivors caring for the dying while simultaneously preparing the dead, with no space left to actually grieve. Burial workers were among the very first to be overwhelmed. Their own numbers, thinned as illness, claimed them too, even as the grave digging never stopped. Cemeteries expanded outward onto farmland. When even that wasn't enough, authorities designated new burial grounds, a decision made purely out of desperate necessity, not ceremony. The dead began lingering in homes longer than tradition allowed, as terrified families found themselves without the strength or the courage to move them. The city's very atmosphere changed. Funeral bells rang almost constantly. The smell of decay lingered in the warmer months. People closed their windows and burned incense, retreating indoors as if that alone could hold the horror at bay. Even the clergy, moving from home to home, were eventually overwhelmed. Prayers shortened. Rites were spoken quickly, sometimes over several bodies at once instead of one at a time. It felt like a betrayal of the dead, and yet abandoning ritual altogether was simply unthinkable. Even a rushed prayer still meant something. Eventually, the state itself stepped in where families no longer could. Burial teams were organized, often recruited from prisoners and laborers, paid what little could be spared, promised protection that was almost impossible to guarantee. Mass graves, trenches built to receive dozens of bodies at once, appeared for the first time on this scale, and the sight of them alone forced residents to finally confront the true size of what was happening around them. Death carts became a normal, expected part of the street. so normal that children grew up watching them pass with an ease that should have been impossible. Wealth stopped mattering. Ranks stopped mattering. The sheer volume of loss flattened every hierarchy the city had ever built. And yet, astonishingly, the city did not descend into chaos. There were no mass riots, no total breakdown of order. People simply didn't have the energy left to rebel. They had only enough left to endure, day after day, burying their dead and continuing forward because continuing forward was the only option left. Historians studying mass mortality events across many centuries have noticed this same strange pattern again and again, that societies buckling under catastrophic loss rarely collapse into anarchy the way fiction often imagines. Instead, they narrow, they simplify. They strip away everything non-essential and focus, with grim efficiency, on the handful of tasks that actually matter for survival. Feeding the living, burying the dead, and getting through one more day. Constantinople in the summer of the Great Mortality did exactly that. It didn't fall apart. It contracted around its own survival, like a fist closing, a government running on fumes. While the streets buckled under the weight of death, the imperial government faced a quieter, equally dangerous crisis. How do you keep an empire running when the very people who run it keep disappearing? The Eastern Roman state depended on an enormous, invisible chain of scribes, messengers, clerks, and local officials, and one by one, illness began breaking that chain. At first, the damage was manageable, the way ordinary death and illness had always been manageable. But the plague didn't remove people one at a time. It removed entire offices within weeks, taking institutional memory with them. The court's response was almost defiant. Keep everything looking normal. Documents still bore the same formal language, the same seals, the same tone of total control. A deliberate performance of stability, even as substance quietly crumbled behind it. Imagine being one of the surviving scribes in this environment. A junior clerk, perhaps, suddenly the most senior person left in an office that once employed a dozen people. You've inherited responsibilities you were never trained for, working from procedures written by men who are now dead, expected to maintain the exact same standard of precision the empire has always demanded, with a fraction of the staff and none of the institutional memory that used to make the job manageable. Multiply this scene across hundreds of offices throughout the empire, and you start to see how governance itself became a kind of improvised performance. Officials doing their genuine best to keep the illusion of a fully functioning state alive, even as the actual machinery behind that illusion grew thinner and more fragile by the week. Taxation became an agonizing balancing act. The state desperately needed revenue. Soldiers required pay, burial operations required funding, yet taxpayers were dying or fleeing faster than anyone could collect from them. Justinian's administration was forced into flexibility it had never wanted, deferring and reducing assessments in the hardest-hit regions, not out of generosity, but because there was simply nothing left to extract. Courts slowed as judges and clerks fell ill. Cases piled up, unresolved, until people simply stopped bothering to bring them, relying instead on private negotiation or quiet resignation. The predictable machinery of Roman law, one of the empire's proudest achievements, began operating on guesswork and improvisation instead. The military felt it too. Recruitment slowed. Training stalled. Campaigns already underway were quietly scaled back rather than formally cancelled, because admitting weakness out loud felt more dangerous than the weakness itself. Messengers grew scarce. Communication between the capital and the provinces deteriorated so badly that governors increasingly made decisions on their own, simply because waiting for instructions from Constantinople had become unreliable and impossibly slow. Nobody officially granted them that independence. Circumstance simply forced it on them. This quiet, unplanned decentralization is one of the more fascinating footnotes of the entire crisis. For centuries, the genius of Roman administration had rested on tight, centralized control. A single set of laws, applied consistently, enforced from a single capital, radiating outward across an enormous territory. The plague broke that model almost by accident, not through any deliberate reform, but simply because the centre could no longer reliably reach the edges. Provincial governors who had once waited weeks for explicit instruction on even minor matters now found themselves making judgment calls independently, setting local precedents that outlasted the crisis that created them. In some regions, This newly earned autonomy never fully reversed, even decades later, once the worst of the plague had passed. Sometimes the most lasting political changes aren't the ones anyone intended to make. Through it all, one priority never wavered. Bread had to keep reaching the population, no matter what else had to be sacrificed to make that happen. Bread shortages could spark unrest even in peaceful times. And unrest, on top of everything else, was a risk the empire simply could not survive. The government did not collapse, but it never regained its old confidence either. People had now watched, firsthand, that the state could manage the consequences of catastrophe, but it could not stop the catastrophe itself. And that realization, quiet as it was, permanently reshaped the relationship between ruler and ruled. Think about what that means for a government built almost entirely on the promise of order. Rome's entire mythology, inherited by Constantinople, rested on the idea that civilization itself was a kind of technology, that with enough law, enough administration, enough careful engineering, chaos could be permanently pushed back. For over 1,000 years, that promise had mostly held. Now, for the first time in living memory, an entire population had watched the machinery of empire grind against a problem it simply could not solve, no matter how many edicts were issued or how many officials were reassigned to handle it. This didn't make people abandon their government. If anything, most clung to it harder, because the alternative, no government at all, in the middle of a mass mortality event, was unthinkable. But something subtle had shifted in how people understood power itself. Authority was no longer something that simply worked. It was something that had to be maintained, defended, and endured through, one crisis at a time, with no guarantee it would ever return to what it had been before. The silent crisis in the countryside. While Constantinople struggled in full public view, the countryside suffered in near total silence. And that silence made it, if anything, even more dangerous. Farming in the empire ran on predictability. Seasons planted at the right time, harvested within a known window, following patterns passed down through generations. The plague shattered that predictability completely. Rural areas were hit later than the cities, thanks to lower population density. But that delay created a false sense of safety. When illness finally did arrive, carried in by a trader or a returning relative, it could wipe out a household's entire labor force within days. A field abandoned mid-harvest doesn't scream for attention the way a city street full of the dying does. It simply fails to produce, quietly, invisibly, until the shortage shows up somewhere else entirely, weeks or months later. Families tried to compensate. Children worked earlier than custom allowed. Elderly relatives returned to labor they'd long since retired from. But ploughing needs strength. Harvesting needs coordination. When too many hands were lost at once, effort alone simply couldn't fill the gap. Livestock suffered right alongside people. Animals left unattended when herders fell ill. Oxen lost that would cripple multiple future seasons, not just the current one. Granaries, under-maintained by dwindling labor, grew damp and vulnerable, inviting exactly the rats and fleas that had started this entire catastrophe in the first place. There's a particular kind of quiet heartbreak in imagining the moment a farming family realized, too late, that they'd lost the season entirely. Perhaps it was a mother, the only one still healthy enough to work, standing at the edge of a half-ploughed field she knew she could never finish alone, calculating in her head how many months the family's stored grain might actually last, and coming up short every time she ran the numbers. Multiply that single, private moment of dread by tens of thousands of households scattered across the empire's countryside, and you begin to understand how an agricultural crisis this quiet could still end up shaping the fate of an entire civilization. And crucially, Egypt, the empire's single most important grain supplier, was suffering the exact same labor collapse. The Nile still flooded on schedule, but the human systems needed to harvest, store, and ship that grain were falling apart, region by region. The state responded exactly as you'd expect, prioritizing Egyptian grain shipments above almost everything else, tapping every reserve available. It bought time. It didn't buy stability. Taxes, still assessed against expected yields that no longer existed, became crushingly unrealistic in the hardest-hit regions. Some officials showed flexibility. Others didn't. and the gap between the two encouraged quiet, informal evasion that the formal economy simply couldn't track anymore. Families began quietly abandoning failing villages for more stable ground, not in dramatic waves, but household by household, guided by rumour and kinship. Some regions never recovered their population. Others slowly absorbed the newcomers. Try to picture the emotional weight of that decision for a single family. Leaving behind land their ancestors had worked for generations, a house holding decades of memory, a small family shrine tended faithfully by parents and grandparents before them, all because the math of survival had simply stopped adding up where they stood. This wasn't the dramatic, sweeping migration of later history books. It was one exhausted family loading what little they could carry onto a borrowed cart, walking toward a cousin's village 2 valleys over, hoping, with no real guarantee, that conditions there might be even slightly better than the ones they were fleeing. And through it all, city dwellers felt this rural catastrophe only indirectly, through thinner bread, fewer vegetables, rising prices, shrinking variety. It was a slow, grinding malnutrition that weakened resistance to disease even further, feeding directly back into the very crisis that caused it. Total famine in Constantinople was narrowly avoided, but only barely, and only because the government sacrificed almost everything else to make it happen. In the countryside itself, no such mercy existed. Some villages endured. Others simply vanished from the map, their fields left to return to scrub, forming the unseen, uncounted foundation on top of which the capital's survival was quietly built. We rarely hear these rural stories because almost no one wrote them down. History, as it's usually recorded, favours emperors and capitals over farmers and villages. But it's worth sitting with the image for a moment anyway. A small farming settlement somewhere in Anatolia or the Syrian hill country, its fields half-planted, its animals wandering untended, its houses slowly emptying one funeral at a time, until one day there simply weren't enough people left to bury the last of the dead, and the village quietly ceased to exist. No chronicler recorded its name, no monument marks where it stood, and yet places exactly like it, scattered by the hundreds across the empire, were the invisible price paid so that bread could keep arriving at Constantinople's docks. A plague without borders. By the time the countryside was buckling under its own quiet catastrophe, the Justinian Plague had already crossed every border the empire had ever drawn. It didn't recognize religion, politics, or rivalry. It simply followed people, and people went everywhere. From Constantinople, it travelled west along the same shipping lanes that had always connected the Mediterranean, striking coastal cities first and then creeping inland along familiar roads. Italy, already exhausted by years of war, was hit especially hard. Rome and Ravenna lost population sharply at the worst possible moment, deepening chaos that conflict had already begun. Gaul and Hispania experienced uneven waves, some regions battered briefly and violently, others enduring years of recurring outbreaks. Even Rome's great rival, Persia, wasn't spared. Shared trade routes and shared battlefields meant the disease crossed the frontier just as easily as any army ever had, and Persian administrators found themselves fighting the exact same losing battle against loss of labour and loss of order. What's striking isn't that the plague spread this far, it's how. It required no new roads, no extraordinary movement. It simply used the connections that already existed, revealing just how deeply interdependent this entire world truly was. Trade patterns shifted in response. Merchants grew cautious, avoiding routes now associated with death. Long-distance luxury trade shrank as regional, essential goods commerce took its place. Some once thriving markets faded permanently. Others rose briefly to fill the gap. Militarily, the effect was just as corrosive. Recruitment, training, and supply all depend on manpower and coordination, and disease drained both, everywhere, all at once. Campaigns stalled, borders weakened. Opportunistic raids crept in through the gaps, though full-scale invasion remained rare, mostly because everyone was too weakened by the same crisis to press an advantage. The most lasting consequence was demographic. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, fewer taxpayers, fewer labourers. A contraction that unfolded across decades, not months, reshaping the entire Mediterranean's balance of power in ways nobody at the time could actually see happening around them. Think about what that quietly did to something as ordinary as a wedding or the birth of a first child. In a world before the plague, a young couple could reasonably assume their parents would live to see grandchildren, that a family trade would pass smoothly from one generation to the next, that a newborn had a fair chance of reaching old age surrounded by siblings and cousins. After the plague settled into its long, recurring rhythm, none of that could be assumed anymore. Every celebration carried a small, unspoken asterisk, a quiet awareness that joy, however real, was never quite guaranteed to last. Contemporaries didn't experience this as one unified catastrophe. They experienced it locally. A lost neighbour, an empty field, a closed workshop. Only later would anyone recognise what they'd actually lived through. Not a single disaster, but the quiet reshaping of an entire interconnected world. Modern estimates for the total death toll across this first great wave of plague, spanning the empire and its neighbours together, range enormously. Anywhere from roughly 25 million to as high as 50 million people, depending on which historian you ask and how much weight they give to the ancient sources versus more conservative modern reconstructions. Some researchers have pushed back hard against the higher figures in recent years, arguing that mortality may have been more regionally concentrated than once believed. But even the most cautious modern estimates still describe a demographic shock on a scale almost impossible to compare to anything else in the historical record before the 20th century. Whole regions of the Mediterranean world, by any reasonable estimate, lost somewhere between a fifth and half of their population within a few short years. Sit with that number for a second. Imagine walking down your own street today and knowing that, statistically, 1 in every 3 or 4 houses would soon stand empty. That was the reality facing an enormous swath of the ancient world. Not for one terrible year, but, as we're about to see, for wave after wave, stretching across generations, when even armies could not stand against it. There's something almost poetic, in a dark way, about an empire that had spent decades perfecting the art of conquest, suddenly discovering an enemy that couldn't be outmaneuvered, outfought, or outnegotiated. Justinian's generals, men like the brilliant Belisarius, who had already achieved the seemingly impossible by retaking North Africa and much of Italy with forces far smaller than anyone expected, had spent their careers mastering the calculus of siege warfare, cavalry tactics, and supply logistics. None of that expertise meant anything against a bacterium moving invisibly through a barracks. You cannot outflank a flea. You cannot negotiate terms with a fever. For perhaps the first time in the empire's long military history, its finest commanders found themselves facing an opponent that simply didn't play by any of the rules war had ever followed before. As the plague kept returning in unpredictable waves, its toll on military power became impossible to ignore. Armies, like cities and farms, depend on coordinated, healthy people, and disease attacked exactly that foundation. Before the plague, the Eastern Roman military had been one of history's most sophisticated fighting forces. Professional soldiers, broad recruitment, relentless training, and supply lines stretched impressively across entire continents. And it was precisely this efficiency that made it so vulnerable. Soldiers lived, packed together, shared equipment, moved constantly between camps. Ideal conditions for a disease looking for exactly that kind of density. Losses were brutally uneven. Some units were gutted entirely. Others escaped almost untouched, which made planning nearly impossible for commanders who could no longer trust their own numbers. Reinforcements arrived late, undertrained, and inexperienced. And fear did quiet damage of its own. Soldiers who simply never returned from leave, requests for reassignment away from the worst-hit fronts, a slow bleed of manpower that was almost impossible to track. Supply chains, already strained by the same plague hitting the civilians who fed them, grew unreliable. Horses were sold off to feed starving populations instead of pulling supply carts. Justinian's government made the only choice it realistically could, concentrating resources on the fronts that mattered most, quietly abandoning the rest. Italy absorbed some of the worst damage, its garrisons thinning until control in some regions became nominal at best, resting more on local arrangement than actual imperial force. Along the Persian frontier, both empires found themselves facing identical demographic exhaustion, which, strangely, kept large-scale war at bay simply because neither side could afford to fight one. In the Balkans, weakened defences invited persistent small raids that steadily eroded security nobody had the manpower left to fully restore. Naval power suffered too. Fewer sailors, slower shipyards, thinner patrols, weaker control over the very sea lanes that carried both commerce and military strength. And yet the military never disintegrated. Discipline held. Command structures survived. But its posture shifted permanently, from expansion to defense, from conquest to consolidation, from ambition to simple endurance. This wasn't a decision announced in any decree. It emerged, quietly, out of sheer necessity, campaign after campaign, until holding the border replaced, extending it as the empire's only realistic goal. Picture Justinian, decades into his reign, looking at maps that once represented a dream of a fully restored Roman world. Italy, North Africa, fragments of Spain, all brought back under one banner, and slowly, painfully accepting that the empire simply no longer had the bodies to hold what it had already won, let alone reach for anything more. That is perhaps the plague's cruelest achievement. It didn't just kill the people who might have fought in future campaigns. It quietly, permanently killed the possibility of the campaigns themselves, closing off futures that might otherwise have been written very differently. Waves that never truly stopped. Even after the worst months finally passed, there was no true relief, because the plague simply refused to leave for good. It returned again and again in waves with no discernible rhythm, no predictable season, no boundary anyone could count on for safety. The first decline in deaths brought cautious hope. Streets grew a little busier. Burial carts appeared less often. Survivors dared to believe the worst had passed. And then, sometimes within months, sometimes not for years, new cases appeared. There was no pattern to find, no comfort in prediction. People stopped asking whether the plague would return. They started asking only when. This long fear, as later generations would come to understand it, reshaped behaviour at every level. Marriages were delayed, construction projects abandoned mid-build, investments held back indefinitely. Why commit to a future that might be erased within a single season? Neighbourhoods that had begun rebuilding were struck again, erasing months of slow recovery overnight. In the countryside, fields replanted after one loss were abandoned after the next, and livestock herds rebuilt with painstaking effort were reduced right back to nothing. The countryside never experienced a single complete recovery, only endless, exhausting cycles of partial restoration, undone again and again. The psychological cost was staggering. Human beings can endure enormous hardship when they believe it will eventually end. Recurring plague stripped that belief away entirely, turning fear from something acute into something chronic. A permanent, background hum woven into daily expectation rather than a response to any single crisis. Faith adapted in response. Early on, the plague had been framed as punishment or trial. Over time, that shifted towards something quieter. Endurance, humility, the slow acceptance that suffering might simply continue without any clear resolution in sight. Physicians adapted too, no longer chasing cures they knew were impossible, focusing instead on comfort and observation. A whole generation grew up knowing nothing else. Where their parents remembered a world before the plague, these children had never lived in one. Instability wasn't a crisis to them. It was simply normal life. Armies, farms, workshops, families. All of it existed now in a state of permanent partial recovery, rebuilding only to be knocked down again. And through it all, life somehow continued. Children were still born, crops were still planted. Survival itself became the achievement, not through heroism, but through the quiet, stubborn human talent for adjusting to almost anything, even prolonged uncertainty with no end in sight. Historians now generally agree that this first great outbreak wasn't a single event at all, but the opening chapter of what's often called the First Plague Pandemic, a series of recurring waves that would keep returning to the Mediterranean world for roughly 200 years, flaring up every decade or so somewhere across the empire before finally, sometime in the 8th century, fading out for good. 200 years. Think about what that actually means in human terms. That means nobody alive when the plague first arrived in 541 would ever live to see a world without it. Their children wouldn't see it end. Very possibly, neither would their grandchildren. An entire civilization built its expectations, its architecture, its art, its very sense of what a normal life looked like, around the assumption that plague was simply one of the permanent conditions of being alive. A world rebuilt around loss. Picture a landowner, decades into this new reality, walking his half-empty estate and doing math he never expected to have to do, counting how many tenant families remained, calculating whether he could even harvest what he'd planted, wondering whether offering better terms to a passing labourer might be the only thing standing between a full harvest and a wasted season. This wasn't charity. It wasn't some grand awakening of conscience. It was simple, unavoidable arithmetic forced onto an entire class of people who had never needed to think this way before. Scarcity, it turns out, is one of history's most effective, if most brutal, teachers. As the decades of recurring plague stretched on, the empire didn't simply wait to recover. It adapted. Not through any grand reform, but through millions of small, individual decisions made under relentless pressure. Decisions that slowly reshaped an entire economy and society. The most immediate effect was labour, scarcity, and it never really eased, because every new wave reinforced it further. And here's the strange twist. This scarcity actually shifted power toward the survivors. Landowners who once dictated harsh terms now faced empty fields and had no choice but to offer better ones. Reduced rent, renegotiated obligations, greater freedom of movement for labourers who once had none. Skilled urban workers found the same new leverage. Wages rose in trades where surviving craftsmen suddenly had bargaining power they'd never held before. But apprenticeships collapsed alongside this shift. Training an apprentice required years of investment nobody wanted to risk when the next wave could arrive at any moment, quietly strangling the transmission of skill from one generation to the next. Markets shrank and grew unpredictable. Long-distance luxury trade all but disappeared, replaced by cautious, essential goods-only commerce. Cities depopulated gradually, empty houses accumulating street by street, entire neighbourhoods shrinking permanently as families vanished or consolidated for mutual support. Social hierarchy, at least on paper, remained untouched. But lived experience told a different story. Wealth couldn't buy immunity. Rank offered no real protection. Shared vulnerability quietly blurred boundaries that law still insisted were rigid. Religious charity expanded to fill the gaps left behind by weakened families and an overwhelmed state, becoming something routine rather than exceptional. Family structures bent under the pressure too. Extended families consolidated to pool scarce labour. Orphans were absorbed by relatives or religious institutions. Marriages were rushed or delayed depending entirely on circumstance rather than tradition. Inheritance became unpredictable as sudden deaths scattered property in directions nobody had planned for. Women, meanwhile, quietly took on far greater economic responsibility. Managing land, overseeing labour, engaging directly in trade, expanding their practical authority even where the law never officially caught up. None of this was revolutionary in any single moment. It was accumulative, each small adjustment layering on top of the last until, without anyone quite noticing the exact turning point, the shape of the entire society had shifted. Smaller, more cautious, more flexible out of necessity rather than any real change of heart. And yet, remarkably, still recognizable. Markets still opened. Families still formed. Authority still stood, however thinner it had grown. Some historians have gone even further, arguing that this demographic shock quietly cracked open the rigid social hierarchies of the ancient world in ways that would echo for centuries afterward. When labour becomes this scarce, the old rules about who is allowed to negotiate, who is allowed to move, who is allowed to demand better terms, simply stop making sense. A landowner in the year 530 could dictate almost any terms he wanted to a desperate tenant. A landowner in the year 560, facing empty fields and a workforce that had learned it, could simply walk to the next estate and find better treatment, no longer had that luxury. Nobody wrote a manifesto about it. Nobody declared a new social order. It just happened, quietly, field by field, contract by contract, as the balance of power between those who owned land and those who worked it tilted, however slightly, in a direction it had never tilted before, a world remade by loss. By the time the plague's worst waves finally receded, the Mediterranean world was simply no longer what it had been at the start of Justinian's reign. No single battle, law, or decree marked the change. It arrived instead through years of accumulated loss, quiet adaptation, and hard-earned restraint. The demographic toll was the most fundamental transformation of all. Crowded cities grew noticeably thinner. Some neighborhoods never recovered. Rural land, especially in marginal regions, stayed depopulated for generations. And this single shift rippled through absolutely everything: economic capacity, military strength, cultural ambition, political reach. Archaeologists working in the region today can sometimes trace this shift directly in the ground itself. Layers of soil that show reduced farming activity stretching across decades, construction that simply stops mid-project and is never resumed, coins from this period found in smaller, more modest hoards than the generations before or after. The evidence isn't always dramatic. Often it's the opposite: a conspicuous, prolonged absence of the ordinary signs of a thriving, busy civilization, buried quietly under centuries of dust, waiting for someone with a trowel and a great deal of patience to notice that something, for a very long stretch of time, had gone unmistakably quiet. Cities didn't vanish, but their character changed. Buildings that once housed multiple families now stood half empty. Public spaces felt larger, quieter. Where authorities had once raced to build new monuments, they now focused entirely on simply keeping what already existed functional. Trade remained, but grew more cautious and more local, gaining fewer new connections than it lost. Political power thinned along with population. Central authority survived, but provincial governors now exercised far more independence out of sheer necessity. Imperial directives mattered less than local, practical arrangement. Justinian's legal reforms endured as a lasting legacy, but the ambition behind his reign, restoration, expansion, a Rome made whole again, quietly gave way to something smaller: consolidation, preservation, endurance. Militarily, the empire settled permanently into a defensive posture. Fortifications were maintained rather than extended. Borders held, but grew undeniably more porous. Culturally, grand patronage faded, but preservation took its place. Texts copied, traditions carefully maintained, even as new creations slowed to a crawl. Faith, more than anything else, became the era's true anchor, offering endurance and humility as core virtues for a population that had learned, the hardest way imaginable, that stability could never again be assumed. Communities grew smaller and more tightly bound, trust becoming practical rather than idealistic, cooperation something people leaned on out of necessity rather than sentiment. Even the land itself changed quietly. Abandoned fields slowly returning to wild scrub, forests reclaiming ground that farming had once demanded, human pressure on the landscape easing without anyone ever planning it that way. The Mediterranean did not fall into darkness. It simply grew quieter, slower, more careful. A world that had learned, through decades of accumulated grief, to value endurance over ambition and survival over growth. That lesson would shape the centuries that followed, embedded so deeply into institutions and instinct that most people who lived it never fully understood exactly how much had changed beneath their feet. Some historians even argue, and this is genuinely debated, so take it as one perspective among several, that the plague quietly helped set the stage for the world that came after Rome entirely. A weakened, thinly populated Eastern Empire had less strength to reassert control over the Italian peninsula. A depopulated, financially strained Persia, worn down by the very same waves of disease, found itself less able to resist the entirely new force that would burst out of Arabia within a century. The armies of the early Islamic conquests, sweeping through territories that plague had already left exhausted and undermanned. None of this means the plague caused everything that followed. History is rarely that simple. But it's difficult to look at the map of the 7th century without wondering how differently it might have been drawn if two of the era's great superpowers hadn't spent the preceding 100 years quietly bleeding population, generation after generation, in a war against an enemy neither of them could even see. A story that keeps repeating itself. Here's something worth sitting with before we close tonight. If parts of this story have felt strangely, uncomfortably familiar to you, the early dismissal of distant reports, the slow realization that something serious was underway, the arguments over whether to keep trade and travel moving or shut everything down, the exhaustion that set in after wave refused to be the last one. That familiarity isn't an accident. The Justinian Plague was the first of 3 great pandemics caused by the same bacterium to reshape human history. The second arrived 8 centuries later as the Black Death, killing perhaps a third of Europe's population within a few catastrophic years in the 14th century. The third struck at the very end of the 19th century, originating in China and eventually reaching port cities around the entire globe, carried, once again, by ships, by rats, by the same ancient, patient bacterium finding new opportunities in a newly interconnected world. And more recently still, an entire generation watched a very different pathogen exploit the very same vulnerabilities that undid 6th century Constantinople, a deeply interconnected world, dense urban populations, and the impossible tension between the economic necessity of keeping things moving and the medical necessity of shutting them down. The technology changes, the bacterium or virus changes, but the underlying human story, confidence meeting an invisible threat it never saw coming, has a way of returning, generation after generation, dressed in slightly different clothes. None of this is meant to frighten you. If anything, understanding this pattern is oddly reassuring, because it means we're not the first people to face this particular kind of fear, and we won't be the last. Every single time, eventually, the wave recedes. Every single time, people rebuild. That doesn't erase the loss. But it does mean the story of the Justinian Plague isn't really a story from the distant, disconnected past. It's a chapter in a much longer story that includes us too. What the ground remembered, even when people forgot. For nearly 1,500 years, the Justinian Plague existed almost entirely as text. A handful of chronicles, a few vivid passages from Procopius, scattered mentions in letters and sermons. Historians debated its true scale endlessly, some suspecting ancient writers had exaggerated for dramatic or religious effect, the way ancient sources so often did. Without hard evidence, the plague risked being remembered as a powerful story rather than a fully believed fact. Then the ground started talking. Over the past 2 decades, archaeologists and geneticists began extracting DNA from skeletons buried in mass graves across Europe and the Mediterranean. Sites where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies had clearly been buried together in haste, exactly the kind of burial pattern you'd expect from a catastrophe overwhelming the normal capacity for individual funerals. Buried in the dental pulp of these skeletons, protected for centuries inside the hard enamel of a tooth, researchers found unmistakable traces of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, confirming what the old chronicles had described all along. This kind of evidence has done something remarkable. It's turned what was once treated as a possibly exaggerated ancient legend into one of the best documented pandemics of the pre-modern world, verified not just by the words of long-dead writers, but by the actual bacterial genome preserved in the bones of its victims. Tree ring data and ice core samples have added even more texture to the story, revealing that a period of unusual global cooling, likely triggered by a series of massive volcanic eruptions in the years just before the plague struck, may have disrupted harvests and weakened populations across Eurasia right before the disease arrived, priming an already stressed world for catastrophe. It's a strange kind of comfort, in a way, knowing that the fear described by a Byzantine court historian nearly a millennium and a half ago has now been confirmed, molecule by molecule, by scientists working with tools he couldn't have possibly imagined. The past, it turns out, is more durable than we sometimes assume. It waits, patiently, in the smallest places. A tooth, a bone fragment, a few strands of ancient DNA, for someone, eventually, to come looking. How a catastrophe becomes a memory. When the Justinian Plague finally loosened its grip, there was no clean ending. No final outbreak anyone could point to and say, that was the last one. It simply faded unevenly, lingering in some places, vanishing from others, flickering back sporadically before falling silent for good. For those who lived through it, the end didn't feel like relief. It felt like exhaustion, slowly giving way to something resembling normal life again. Memory formed the same way grief always does, personally first. A missing face at the market, a craft that ended because its last practitioner had died, a street that never sounded the same again. Only years later did these fragmented, personal memories start weaving together into shared stories. Stories that shifted depending on who told them, whether they came from a city that remembered scarcity and death, or a village that remembered broken harvests and empty fields. Chroniclers captured only pieces of the real experience, favouring moral lessons and divine meaning over precise numbers. What mattered to them, and to the people living through it, wasn't accuracy. It was coherence. People needed a framework that let them keep going, and religion offered exactly that. Suffering as trial, as test, as something endured collectively rather than randomly inflicted. The demographic scar never fully healed. In many regions, populations stayed lower for generations, quietly limiting what states could tax, whom they could conscript, what they could realistically ambition toward. Justinian's legal reforms endured, but they operated now in a much smaller, more cautious world, one where flexibility had become permanent habit rather than temporary crisis response. It's worth pausing on what this meant for Justinian personally in the final years of his long reign. He had come to power dreaming of a restored Rome, unified under one law, one faith, one emperor, stretching from Spain to the Persian frontier. He died, decades later, having achieved fragments of that dream, but ruling over an empire with a fraction of the population, a fraction of the tax revenue, and a fraction of the military reach it once commanded. History would remember him as one of the most consequential rulers Rome ever produced. But even he, by the end, must have understood that the empire he was leaving behind looked nothing like the one he had once believed he could rebuild. Culturally, the instinct shifted from creation toward preservation. Texts copied to keep them from vanishing, traditions maintained rather than expanded, monumental ambition quietly abandoned in favour of simply holding on to what remained. Socially, legal hierarchy stayed on the books, even as lived reality steadily blurred it, shared vulnerability having taught an entire civilization that neither wealth nor rank could offer real protection from anything that truly mattered. Later, historians would argue endlessly over what this all meant, some calling it the true end of the ancient world, others insisting on continuity and resilience instead. The truth sits somewhere between both, not a collapse, and not a seamless continuation, but a long, quiet redirection. Ambition trading places with caution, expansion trading places with maintenance, confidence trading places permanently with endurance. And perhaps that's the real, lasting legacy of the Justinian Plague. Not simply the staggering death toll, though that alone reshaped an entire world, but the reminder, etched into habit, into governance, into the quiet caution of everyday decisions for generations afterward, that even the most confident, most carefully engineered civilization is only ever one invisible passenger away from having to learn, all over again, just how fragile permanence really is. It's tempting, sitting here comfortably 15 centuries later, to feel a kind of distance from all of this, to treat it purely as history, safely sealed behind glass, something that happened to them and not to us. But the truth is a little less comfortable than that. Every generation, including our own, tends to believe its own systems are the ones that finally got it right. That we, unlike the people of 6th century Constantinople, have built something too sophisticated, too well understood, too well defended to be blindsided the way they were. And every generation before us believed exactly the same thing, right up until the moment they didn't. That isn't meant as a grim note to end on. If anything, it's the opposite. Because the story of the Justinian Plague isn't really a story about how a civilization failed. It's a story about how one endured something almost unimaginable and kept going anyway. How bakers kept baking, how physicians kept treating patients they couldn't save, how families kept burying their dead with whatever fragment of ritual they could still afford, how an emperor got back on his feet and kept ruling, how a city that lost perhaps a third of its people never stopped being a city. Confidence, it turns out, was never really the thing holding that world together. Endurance was. And endurance, unlike confidence, doesn't shatter the moment reality gets complicated. It bends, absorbs, adjusts, and, quietly, stubbornly, carries on. That, in the end, might be the real lesson buried under 1,500 years of dust. Not that the world is fragile, though it is, but that people, again and again, throughout history, have proven far more resilient than the systems they built to protect themselves. Thank you for spending this evening with Shaded Past. If this story kept you here until the very end, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Until next time, sleep well. Social hierarchy, at least on paper, remained untouched. But lived experience told a different story. Wealth couldn't buy immunity. Rank offered no real protection. Shared vulnerability quietly blurred boundaries that law still insisted were rigid. Religious charity expanded to fill the gaps left behind by weakened families and an overwhelmed state, becoming something routine rather than exceptional. Family structures bent under the pressure too. Extended families consolidated to pool scarce labour. Orphans were absorbed by relatives or religious institutions. Marriages were rushed or delayed depending entirely on circumstance rather than tradition. Inheritance became unpredictable as sudden deaths scattered property in directions nobody had planned for. Women, meanwhile, quietly took on far greater economic responsibility. Managing land, overseeing labour, engaging directly in trade, expanding their practical authority even where the law never officially caught up. None of this was revolutionary in any single moment. It was accumulative, each small adjustment layering on top of the last until, without anyone quite noticing the exact turning point, the shape of the entire society had shifted. Smaller, more cautious, more flexible out of necessity rather than any real change of heart. And yet, remarkably, still recognizable. Markets still opened. Families still formed. Authority still stood, however thinner it had grown. Some historians have gone even further, arguing that this demographic shock quietly cracked open the rigid social hierarchies of the ancient world in ways that would echo for centuries afterward. When labour becomes this scarce, the old rules about who is allowed to negotiate, who is allowed to move, who is allowed to demand better terms, simply stop making sense. A landowner in the year 530 could dictate almost any terms he wanted to a desperate tenant. A landowner in the year 560, facing empty fields and a workforce that had learned it, could simply walk to the next estate and find better treatment, no longer had that luxury. Nobody wrote a manifesto about it. Nobody declared a new social order. It just happened, quietly, field by field, contract by contract, as the balance of power between those who owned land and those who worked it tilted, however slightly, in a direction it had never tilted before, a world remade by loss. By the time the plague's worst waves finally receded, the Mediterranean world was simply no longer what it had been at the start of Justinian's reign. No single battle, law, or decree marked the change. It arrived instead through years of accumulated loss, quiet adaptation, and hard-earned restraint. The demographic toll was the most fundamental transformation of all. Crowded cities grew noticeably thinner. Some neighbourhoods never recovered. Rural land, especially in marginal regions, stayed depopulated for generations. And this single shift rippled through absolutely everything: economic capacity, military strength, cultural ambition, political reach. Archaeologists working in the region today can sometimes trace this shift directly in the ground itself. Layers of soil that show reduced farming activity stretching across decades, construction that simply stops mid-project and is never resumed, coins from this period found in smaller, more modest hoards than the generations before or after. The evidence isn't always dramatic. Often it's the opposite. A conspicuous, prolonged absence of the ordinary signs of a thriving, busy civilization, buried quietly under centuries of dust, waiting for someone with a trowel and a great deal of patience to notice that something, for a very long stretch of time, had gone unmistakably quiet, Cities didn't vanish, but their character changed. Buildings that once housed multiple families now stood half empty. Public spaces felt larger, quieter. Where authorities had once raced to build new monuments, they now focused entirely on simply keeping what already existed functional. Trade remained, but grew more cautious and more local, gaining fewer new connections than it lost. Political power thinned along with population. Central authority survived, but provincial governors now exercised far more independence out of sheer necessity. Imperial directives mattered less than local, practical arrangement. Justinian's legal reforms endured as a lasting legacy, but the ambition behind his reign, restoration, expansion, a Rome made whole again, quietly gave way to something smaller. Consolidation, preservation, endurance. Militarily, the empire settled permanently into a defensive posture. Fortifications were maintained rather than extended. Borders held, but grew undeniably more porous. Culturally, grand patronage faded, but preservation took its place. Texts copied, traditions carefully maintained, even as new creations slowed to a crawl. Faith, more than anything else, became the era's true anchor, offering endurance and humility as core virtues for a population that had learned, the hardest way imaginable, that stability could never again be assumed. Communities grew smaller and more tightly bound, trust becoming practical rather than idealistic, cooperation something people leaned on out of necessity rather than sentiment. Even the land itself changed quietly. Abandoned fields slowly returning to wild scrub, forests reclaiming ground that farming had once demanded, human pressure on the landscape easing without anyone ever planning it that way. The Mediterranean did not fall into darkness. It simply grew quieter, slower, more careful. A world that had learned, through decades of accumulated grief, to value endurance over ambition and survival over growth. That lesson would shape the centuries that followed, embedded so deeply into institutions and instinct that most people who lived it never fully understood exactly how much had changed beneath their feet. Some historians even argue, and this is genuinely debated, so take it as one perspective among several, that the plague quietly helped set the stage for the world that came after Rome entirely. A weakened, thinly populated Eastern Empire had less strength to reassert control over the Italian peninsula. A depopulated, financially strained Persia, worn down by the very same waves of disease, found itself less able to resist the entirely new force that would burst out of Arabia within a century. The armies of the early Islamic conquests, sweeping through territories that plague had already left exhausted and undermanned. None of this means the plague caused everything that followed. History is rarely that simple, but it's difficult to look at the map of the 7th century without wondering how differently it might have been drawn if two of the era's great superpowers hadn't spent the preceding 100 years quietly bleeding population, generation after generation, in a war against an enemy neither of them could even see. A story that keeps repeating itself. Here's something worth sitting with before we close tonight. If parts of this story have felt strangely, uncomfortably familiar to you, the early dismissal of distant reports, the slow realization that something serious was underway, the arguments over whether to keep trade and travel moving or shut everything down, the exhaustion that set in after wave refused to be the last one. That familiarity isn't an accident. The Justinian Plague was the first of 3 great pandemics caused by the same bacterium to reshape human history. The second arrived 8 centuries later as the Black Death, killing perhaps a third of Europe's population within a few catastrophic years in the 14th century. The third struck at the very end of the 19th century, originating in China and eventually reaching port cities around the entire globe, carried, once again, by ships, by rats, by the same ancient, patient bacterium finding new opportunities in a newly interconnected world. And more recently still, an entire generation watched a very different pathogen exploit the very same vulnerabilities that undid 6th century Constantinople, a deeply interconnected world, dense urban populations, and the impossible tension between the economic necessity of keeping things moving and the medical necessity of shutting them down. The technology changes. The bacterium or virus changes. But the underlying human story, confidence meeting an invisible threat it never saw coming, has a way of returning, generation after generation, dressed in slightly different clothes. None of this is meant to frighten you. If anything, understanding this pattern is oddly reassuring, because it means we're not the first people to face this particular kind of fear, and we won't be the last. Every single time, eventually, the wave recedes. Every single time, people rebuild. That doesn't erase the loss. But it does mean the story of the Justinian Plague isn't really a story from the distant, disconnected past. It's a chapter in a much longer story that includes us too. What the ground remembered, even when people forgot. For nearly 1,500 years, the Justinian Plague existed almost entirely as text. A handful of chronicles, a few vivid passages from Procopius, scattered mentions in letters and sermons. Historians debated its true scale endlessly, some suspecting ancient writers had exaggerated for dramatic or religious effect, the way ancient sources so often did. Without hard evidence, the plague risked being remembered as a powerful story rather than a fully believed fact. Then the ground started talking. Over the past 2 decades, archaeologists and geneticists began extracting DNA from skeletons buried in mass graves across Europe and the Mediterranean. Sites where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies had clearly been buried together in haste, exactly the kind of burial pattern you'd expect from a catastrophe overwhelming the normal capacity for individual funerals. Buried in the dental pulp of these skeletons, protected for centuries inside the hard enamel of a tooth, researchers found unmistakable traces of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, confirming what the old chronicles had described all along. This kind of evidence has done something remarkable. It's turned what was once treated as a possibly exaggerated ancient legend into one of the best documented pandemics of the pre-modern world, verified not just by the words of long-dead writers, but by the actual bacterial genome preserved in the bones of its victims. Tree ring data and ice core samples have added even more texture to the story, revealing that a period of unusual global cooling, likely triggered by a series of massive volcanic eruptions in the years just before the plague struck, may have disrupted harvests and weakened populations across Eurasia right before the disease arrived, priming an already stressed world for catastrophe. It's a strange kind of comfort, in a way, knowing that the fear described by a Byzantine court historian nearly a millennium and a half ago has now been confirmed, molecule by molecule, by scientists working with tools he couldn't have possibly imagined. The past, it turns out, is more durable than we sometimes assume. It waits, patiently, in the smallest places. A tooth, a bone fragment, a few strands of ancient DNA, for someone, eventually, to come looking. How a catastrophe becomes a memory. When the Justinian Plague finally loosened its grip, there was no clean ending, no final outbreak anyone could point to and say, that was the last one. It simply faded unevenly, lingering in some places, vanishing from others, flickering back sporadically before falling silent for good. For those who lived through it, the end didn't feel like relief. It felt like exhaustion, slowly giving way to something resembling normal life again. Memory formed the same way grief always does, personally first. A missing face at the market, a craft that ended because its last practitioner had died, a street that never sounded the same again. Only years later did these fragmented, personal memories start weaving together into shared stories. Stories that shifted depending on who told them, whether they came from a city that remembered scarcity and death, or a village that remembered broken harvests and empty fields. Chroniclers captured only pieces of the real experience, favouring moral lessons and divine meaning over precise numbers. What mattered to them, and to the people living through it, wasn't accuracy. It was coherence. People needed a framework that let them keep going, and religion offered exactly that. Suffering as trial, as test, as something endured collectively rather than randomly inflicted. The demographic scar never fully healed. In many regions, populations stayed lower for generations, quietly limiting what states could tax, whom they could conscript, what they could realistically ambition toward. Justinian's legal reforms endured, but they operated now in a much smaller, more cautious world, one where flexibility had become permanent habit rather than temporary crisis response. It's worth pausing on what this meant for Justinian personally in the final years of his long reign. He had come to power dreaming of a restored Rome, unified under one law, one faith, one emperor, stretching from Spain to the Persian frontier. He died, decades later, having achieved fragments of that dream, but ruling over an empire with a fraction of the population, a fraction of the tax revenue, and a fraction of the military reach it once commanded. History would remember him as one of the most consequential rulers Rome ever produced. But even he, by the end, must have understood that the empire he was leaving behind looked nothing like the one he had once believed he could rebuild. Culturally, the instinct shifted from creation toward preservation. Texts copied to keep them from vanishing, traditions maintained rather than expanded, monumental ambition quietly abandoned in favor of simply holding on to what remained. Socially, legal hierarchy stayed on the books, even as lived reality steadily blurred it, shared vulnerability having taught an entire civilization that neither wealth nor rank could offer real protection from anything that truly mattered. Later, historians would argue endlessly over what this all meant, some calling it the true end of the ancient world, others insisting on continuity and resilience instead. The truth sits somewhere between both, not a collapse, and not a seamless continuation, but a long, quiet redirection. Ambition trading places with caution, expansion trading places with maintenance, confidence trading places permanently with endurance. And perhaps that's the real, lasting legacy of the Justinian Plague. Not simply the staggering death toll, though that alone reshaped an entire world, but the reminder, etched into habit, into governance, into the quiet caution of everyday decisions for generations afterward, that even the most confident, most carefully engineered civilization is only ever one invisible passenger away from having to learn, all over again, just how fragile permanence really is. It's tempting, sitting here comfortably 15 centuries later, to feel a kind of distance from all of this, to treat it purely as history, safely sealed behind glass, something that happened to them and not to us. But the truth is a little less comfortable than that. Every generation, including our own, tends to believe its own systems are the ones that finally got it right. That we, unlike the people of 6th century Constantinople, have built something too sophisticated, too well understood, too well defended to be blindsided the way they were. And every generation before us believed exactly the same thing, right up until the moment they didn't. That isn't meant as a grim note to end on. If anything, it's the opposite. Because the story of the Justinian Plague isn't really a story about how a civilization failed. It's a story about how one endured something almost unimaginable and kept going anyway. How bakers kept baking, how physicians kept treating patients they couldn't save, how families kept burying their dead with whatever fragment of ritual they could still afford, how an emperor got back on his feet and kept ruling, how a city that lost perhaps a third of its people never stopped being a city. Confidence, it turns out, was never really the thing holding that world together. Endurance was. And endurance, unlike confidence, doesn't shatter the moment reality gets complicated. It bends, absorbs, adjusts, and, quietly, stubbornly, carries on. That, in the end, might be the real lesson buried under 1,500 years of dust. Not that the world is fragile, though it is, but that people, again and again, throughout history, have proven far more resilient than the systems they built to protect themselves. Thank you for spending this evening with Shaded Past. If this story kept you here until the very end, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Until next time, sleep well.